Welcome to the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron William Perry, and today we're visiting with physics professor William Karstens, also known as Sandy. Hey, Sandy.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
Well, it's good. It's first day we've got a little bit of sun after a few days of cloud and just boring dreariness, so it's good.
Well, it might look like the photo you've got up on your screen behind you there.
I can only wish.
Yeah. William Karstens is a professor of physics at St. Michael's College in Vermont. His research areas include optical properties of solids, Einstein's general relativity, particle physics, and cosmology. Sandy received his undergraduate degree in physics from the University of Vermont, his master's degree in physics from Brandeis University, and his PhD in materials science from the University of Vermont. He is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate and also studies history, philosophy, and religion. Sandy has been involved in Boy Scouts for over 15 years and is in the Order of the Arrow. He is also a Freemason, the Grand Junior Warden in the Grand Line of the Grand Lodge of Vermont, and is active in the Scottish and York Rites. He is married with 2 grown children and loves to canoe and camp in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. Sandy, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to visit with you today. And I know you're going to be sharing a slideshow with us on physics and sacred geometry, which I imagine many of our audience are going to find very interesting and enriching. And I've had an opportunity a few weeks back to get a kind of sneak peek at your work. And I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share this with our Why on Earth community audience.
Good, glad.
Well, what do you think? Should we just jump right into it and get to your presentation?
Yeah, what I'll do is for the audience, I'll be sharing a screen of a few slides that I did for a much larger talk, and I'll do that now, just so we have that up. All right. So the term sacred geometry probably is a bit of a loaded and maybe overused term. So the things that you'll see here may not be what you're expecting. It's likely that if you hear the term sacred geometry, people will usually think of the golden mean or the golden ratio, sometimes called the Greek letter phi. And that's also kind of conjures up images of the Fibonacci series and logarithmic spirals. Those are kind of built into this to a degree, and I'll make mention of it a little bit. What I chose to go at for this particular presentation that I gave were the ideas of the Trinity, 3s and 2s, and how they generate a few other little patterns. The goal of this really was to show that these things show up at the foundation of particle physics and the way we classify and understand particles in general. So I opened up with a nice little picture here of a Trinity, 3, with a red, blue, and green. And this is hinting at the colors associated with the gluons or quark properties. But this can go much beyond that, because I'm kind of convinced of the idea of a kind of a rule of 3 in life. But that's for more conversations down the line. I had hinted at the fact that for many people, mathematics is usually something to avoid. And I think that maybe that's a bit harsh, because if you look a little deeper, there's a lot more beauty there than you think. And on the topic of the idea of a sacred geometry, the idea of sacred really is something that conjures up a sense of sacramental. As a Catholic myself, one of the things that we learn about is that the Catholic faith is a sacramental one. So what exactly does that mean? In the broadest sense, it means you pretty much see God in all things around you. And I think that one definition that I kind of pulled off of a fellow by the name of Michael Himes, he's a theologian at Boston College. And he says that the sacramental principle, obviously in the context somewhat more directly in terms of religion, but I think we can broaden that. The sacramental principle, he says, that which is always and everywhere the case must be noticed, accepted, and celebrated somewhere, sometime. And I think that's kind of the idea here, is that you look at the pictures and you look at the geometry that we show here, and everything in some sense can be sacramental if it reminds you about the deeper mysteries of life, of the world around you. And I think that, to me, is the bigger draw here. So my picture of the conic sections, people might look at a circle and say, hey, gee, that's a circle, isn't that cute? We like the symmetry and everything else, but did you know that it's part of a broader class of other shapes, the ellipse, parabola, and hyperbola? How does that all figure in? That's related and comes about when you talk about Newton's laws of planetary motion. He found out that when you looked at an inverse square law, that you would generate these different kinds of shapes for orbits, circles being one of them, ellipses being mostly the one that we're used to for our planetary motion around the sun. But also if you do trajectories of comets and other things around large massive objects like the sun, parabolas and hyperbolas may also be the name of the game. So geometry really pervades everything that we see around us. And I think that's the sacramental part of it that I want to draw your attention to more than anything else, is you just kind of make an awareness. It makes you think about things that are a little deeper than just the mundane. This was a picture I showed to kind of start with going from a kind of a unity, if you will, into a duality. This is a kind of a separation, male, female, plus, minus, and whatever. And we're familiar with the yin-yang concept. Connected to this is the idea that there are antiparticles associated with every particle. This is something that Einstein proved with his equations on relativity, that every particle has to have a corresponding antiparticle. So we've introduced duality right off the bat. The trinity that I like, that most people would be familiar with, is what I call the Atomic Trinity. And this one is just a neutron, proton, and electron. So when you think Trinity, this is obviously not maybe the one you were thinking of, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but this is another one. I think we're going to find threes all around you. And that's sort of the idea behind the sacramental piece, is you go, hey, there's another place where three shows up. And the minute you do that, you suddenly go, I'm kind of on track with a much deeper thinking. In between, right in the center there is a gamma, which is a representative of the photon, and that's the electromagnetic interaction that takes place between charged particles. Some other nice pictures that one gets. This is a Meson octet. This was developed ultimately by Murray Gell-Mann and others back in the 60s when they first put together their so-called eightfold way in trying to classify all of the particles that they were confronted with. They were just all over the place, and they were trying to figure out what the heck they had in front of them. And they found a way to classify them in a way that made some sense. And that sense was very geometric. So here you have a nice little hexagon with particles in the center. And this is generated mathematically. So this isn't just like, hey, let's just put them into a nice little hexagon because it looks good. It actually has some mathematical support for doing this. Same thing for the baryons. In this case, you'll notice the neutron and the proton up there on the top, and a few of the other particles that they know and love. Not all of them would be ones that you'd be familiar with, but certainly the idea of being able to put these into these nice patterns. Now, the eightfold way conjures up some thoughts about maybe some other places where the eightfold way would show up. And there are several of them to be certainly noted. That is, on the left is the Buddhist kind of eightfold way, if you will, and on the right, the pictures that are associated with the Taoists and the yin-yang in the middle. But also remember, too, that in the eights, there are 8 Beatitudes if you're a Christian. So 8 shows up in that sense as well. There's a 10. So if you like to go bowling, you'll recognize this shape. The Baryon Decuplet. These are full of other particles that you no doubt probably haven't heard of either. But nevertheless, they are classified very nicely in terms of this grouping. They have similar sorts of properties. The reason they go into this is, again, kind of mathematical, but ultimately the pattern is quite beautiful. 10s show up in other places, of course. So this is if you want to say sacred or sacramental, you can think of, well, what other 10s do you know? Probably the 10 Commandments might come to mind. We, of course, have 10 fingers and 10 toes. So we use the base 10 system for our numbers. But if you're an esotericist, you may know some other interesting little pictures for those that like to follow a little bit of the esoteric ideas of Kabbalah. This is the Tree of Life in its sort of more modern form. And on the two sides are different versions of the Pythagoras called the Tetractys. So basically an arrangement of things. And this is only a couple examples of those things, just to sort of hint at that. Quarks themselves, as we dig a little deeper into the structure of matter, can be arranged in the same kind of trinity arrangement. The quarks and antiquarks, that's what the bar means, up, down, and strange were the first three that they found. Unfortunately or fortunately, they found a few more. So this doesn't really complete the picture, but it's kind of a stepping stone toward the idea of this three. In fact, we go much better than this with the steps on this front. This is how the quarks create those particles that we saw. For the mesons, they're composed of a quark and an antiquark, and for baryons, three quarks themselves. And if you put them together, this was the Meson octet in terms of the quark structure, and this is the Baryon Decuplet and Baryon Octet in terms of the quark structure. So we understand the patterns then as being responsible from a sense of structure underlying all of this, which gets you to think a little bit more carefully about what's going on with nature around you. In the final analysis, we believe we are at the sort of pinnacle here as far as the generations. There are three generations of leptons, the electron being the most familiar for everybody, but there's also a muon and a tau particle, and they each have a corresponding neutrino. And you might have heard about neutrinos in the news a little bit too. Wispy, almost massless particles that are really difficult to detect, but are very important for the weak interactions. So what I like about this particular arrangement is you've got the trinity with the dual aspect, the twos and threes, which kind of form the foundation of evenness and oddness in everything from then on. Same thing with the quarks, which is a nice parallel. So if you're talking about sacred geometry or a sacramental aspect, this is beautiful. I mean, you can't get any more fundamental than this. So you have the down and up, strange, charmed, and bottom and top quarks. They were a little whimsical when they named these things because at the time they were not convinced they were really there. So there's a nice little arrangement of some geometry. Another way to look at it is you can put them around in the hexagons again if you like. But it also, to kind of wrap this up, talks about quark properties in terms of color. Now, it's not that they're actually red, blue, and green, but this became a convenient way to assign a quantum number, a property of the quarks. There are three of these colors, red, blue, and green, and there are, like Einstein had said, there are corresponding anti-colors. So anti-red, anti-blue, and anti-green. So when you put them together on our favorite little plots, you see those famous triangles again, the trinity. One arranged in one direction, one arranged in the other direction, which if you interlock the two triangles, you get, once again, the idea of your hexagon. And the interlocking triangles, of course, also conjures up the idea of your Star of David. So if you look at the gluons, which are the carriers of the strong interaction between quarks, green, red, and blue, anti-green, anti-blue, and anti-red, put those together, and you get a nice little Star of David type of deal. And this is what we call the gluons. So this is just a touch. The reason I had talked about this is that this is the very foundation of particle physics and kind of nature, if you will, of where we stand today. And I thought that was, in some sense, kind of interesting to share with folks, certainly from the group that I was associated with, but as I was asked to share here as well. So at that point, I think that's all the slides that I think I want to get to for this. The other ones I don't think are necessarily more illustrative, but that's kind of the beginning of some of these things.
Hey, Sandy, thank you so much. It's so fascinating. It has me wondering, how the heck do we know all of this? Is this all, the result of mathematics, purely mathematics, or is this also corroborated and developed through observational techniques?
And pretty much at the bottom line with physics, you really do have to come down to the fact that ultimately it is an experimental science. It does touch at the most deepest levels of nature and the world around us and the universe. But if you come up with whatever cockamamie theory you want, it's got to still hold up the test in the lab. So the beginning of at least the quark model was definitely seen as a little bit with suspicion, and that's why the names were given to some of these quarks, because there was a sense of, well, it's convenient, but they're not really there. But yes, indeed, if you, most of the folks, when you look at these kind of particle physics experiments have to use high energies, there's an inverse relation to the energy that you use and the size of the particle that you have to probe. It has to do with the wavelength of the probe. So as the bigger the energy, the smaller the probe length, and that allows you to look at smaller and smaller things. And yes, indeed, certainly for the quarks, they do see very distinct evidence for the presence of quarks in their families, that the way we showed you in terms of the flavors. So the scattering experiments with those great big, huge accelerators are pretty much the place where these sorts of things are experimented with.
Interesting, so interesting. You know, it's making me think about that time several years after Einstein published one of his theories, that some observers were down in, I think, the southern hemisphere, looking at an eclipse. That was the final sort of experimental verification, if you will, of his theory. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, the idea here would be what general relativity would predict is that there's a kind of a distortion, not only in space, but space-time, which is a little harder to kind of put your head around, because we usually see those pictures of indented sort of rubber sheets to get the idea of a kind of a spatial idea. But we can use that as sort of the same kind of idea here, in that if we make that equivalence between mass and energy, that's the famous E equals mc squared term, then when you talk about something with mass, it will behave in much the same way as something with energy. So light, being a form of energy, is massless, but because it's energy, will be affected the same way. So we expect light passing near a very large gravitational object, like the sun, you would find that it should bend, just like a regular particle might, or a planet, or what have you. And so that was the prediction. And they had to wait for the right arrangement to try and see a star that was behind the sun. With the sun being in the way, of course, it was awfully difficult to observe, but with an eclipse, it allowed you to block out the effects of the sun so you can see the effects of the star that was presumably bending around. And sure enough, the star which was behind the sun, the light rays bended around the sun so that in fact they could see it on Earth, where you would expect to not have seen it because of the bending effect. And so they did measurements, and the measurements were right in keeping with the predictions of general relativity. And that was it. That was kind of wow. When you see that coming out, you realize there's something going on here that's just profound.
Well, it's so interesting, and I'll tell you that occurred approximately 100 years ago, plus or minus.
Yeah.
And as you and I were chatting the other day about this history of the development of our mathematics and physics, it was so interesting to me to get a bit of a look into your purview on what has unfolded over the last 300-400 years. And I wanted to ask you, about Newton in particular, because not only was he doing mathematics and physics that really supports our modern approach in a lot of these scientific inquiries, but he was also engaged in alchemy, right? And had a lot of other interesting pursuits that here in our modern times might seem even a little bit out there.
Right. I think it's interesting when you start looking at history, and maybe it's something that happens when you get older. I know when I was a kid, learning about history was just like boring as all get out. It was like, oh my God, we got history class. And I'm sure it was the way it was taught. There was not a sense of that beautiful unification, but that maybe it's just one of those things that you appreciate more as you get older, and you learn more about the world around you, and you make connections, and you realize, oh, that's really interesting how that all played out. So when you look back in time and you look at the sort of era of Newton, Kepler, and Copernicus, and all these individuals that were kind of making these inroads toward observing the universe around us, you realize that they were immersed in a different culture than we're used to today. And so the sense of the sort of spiritual magic, if you will, astrology was sort of the name of the game, and understand that the term astrology was all they had. It really meant the word of the stars, and that there was no astronomy. There was just simply, that was it. Anything to do with the stars was astrology. And some people made use of it in terms of a sense of connection with people and their actions on Earth. But it was really just also just literally observing the stars and being an astronomer. So ultimately, people would make these measurements, and Kepler was certainly one of them that put the lid on the geocentric model, and ultimately said, okay, look, clearly Copernicus had something right. We had to shift our viewpoint, and here are the orbits. Here's what they look like. They weren't circles, they were actually ellipses, which is, when you think about the measurement capability of Copernicus to do that, to discern circles over ellipses in the orbits, was an amazing measurement feat. And ultimately, it shows that what they wanted at the time, the perfection of the circle, was very, like God, and not seeing that was a little bit of a disappointment. But as we've kind of hinted at earlier in my little pictures, the circle and the ellipse are part of a bigger concept in there, the conic sections. So Newton comes along, and he basically, ironically, as they've said on more than one occasion, was in the middle of a pandemic. So he went out to the countryside. He had nothing else to do. He didn't have the internet, and he couldn't Zoom with anybody. So he had himself to sit and ponder these things. In the midst of which he was very heavily involved with a number of individuals in, as you pointed out, in alchemy, in trying to understand these things. And it's difficult to try and pinpoint, where the divisions are, because alchemy certainly did encompass actual things that you work with to kind of provide these understandings of how materials change and what you did. But there was that spiritual sense of it as well. Is it a metaphor for something deeper? It may have been both for him. It's really hard to tell, but you look at the people that they interacted with and the kinds of things that they delved into, and I'm pretty sure there was a feature of both that's in there, because they were interested in the world around them in many ways. So for Newton, the alchemy was a big part of him, but also trying to get at the mathematics as a way of seeing the expression of the deity in the world around him. So there he goes off into his place and has to deal with the concept of change. And so that's where the calculus comes into play for him, and develops the model that we know today as the universal law of gravitation. And lo and behold, derives the conic sections for the orbits of planets obeying the force of gravity of inverse square law, and out pops these things. His equations of motion, just dealing with motion in general, which also had to be folded into that, F equals ma, that some people may know, was very. It took a lot of effort to put that out there, because most people were very Aristotelian. And ironically, when you kind of couple that with the alchemist concept, which usually had within its purview the idea of earth, air, fire, and water, the four elements. And for Aristotle, it was literal. So in other words, things that were, like fire, burn because they had a certain fire quality. Things that were light wanted to be up into the air. So things that floated wanted to be up where the air was. Things that fell to the ground were earth-like. So that's more of a literal concept, but I think that the alchemist idea was a little bit deeper than that. Nevertheless, he pushed against that as far as an understanding of why forces do what they do. So when you think about it, it's a kind of interesting contradiction for him, because he was definitely a practicing alchemist in some way, but in looking at physics, he went right at it with his basic equations of motion, introducing the idea of forces directly related to what we would call an acceleration rather than a velocity. There's a lot tied up with that we talk about in our usual physics classes, but it's interesting that he didn't make use of what was kind of the old Aristotelian way of doing it. And once that was born, we have a very kind of deterministic universe, a mechanistic one that was introduced. I think he would be appalled at what developed because of that, because ultimately, along with the Enlightenment and a lot of other things, people glommed onto the idea that Newton had put together. And ultimately, it seemed to sort of say, oh, well, now we can explain this and we can explain that. And if I look at his equations of motion, all I apparently need are the initial conditions, and then boom, everything is determined from then on. Well, that doesn't sit too well with folks that would like to think about free will and things like that. So obviously it ran up against some detractors. But it also, the mechanistic view kind of got hung on to for the science folks. And we've ever kind of since somewhere in there with the transition, as I said, with the Enlightenment and industrialization, began to kind of move away from the kind of religious aspect of things and a more science aspect of things, which, as I said, I think Newton would be appalled at how that all developed. So,
So it's so interesting, and I want to ask you about the Royal Society and really what in the last 400 years or so was unfolding, and how certain uh, orders or networks like the Masonic order, for example, was helping to form this fabric among different thinkers and natural philosophers over these last few centuries. Do you have a sense of what that kind of looks like over that time period?
it's hard, and the readings I've done introduced different individuals depending on who you talk to, but ultimately, right in the 1600s, seemed to be this sort of zeitgeist of time where people began to think a little bit more carefully about the world around them. Obviously, this is the time when Galileo was making his observations, and the church wasn't exactly pleased with that. Galileo died at the exact birth year of Newton in 1642. So you're getting a lot of these sorts of things kind of happening right around that time. And it seems as though there were characters that were involved in certain sort of a more of a sort of a learning aspect of things, the world, getting together. They were practicing alchemists, but I think the idea here was that they were going at it from a very kind of experimental sense. What happens if? And this was really kind of the dawn of what they sometimes call the invisible college, is that there were some things going on behind the scenes, which because alchemy was then originally okay by the church, because they thought, okay, there's some neat symbolisms and things, and they began to realize that maybe it wasn't exactly what they wanted. And so it was banned in many of the countries. So they had to be quiet about it. In fact, it was punishable by death in some cases. So they really, really had to be quiet. And so they would do a lot of things behind closed doors with secret messages and everything else. At the same time, folks seemed to be a part of these Masonic lodges that were around. Whether this was, there's definite got documentation for people of lodges that were taking place in there. The official Grand Lodge of England didn't happen until 1717, but there were a lot of things that were going on before that. And it seemed that the same people that were part of these lodges were also the same individuals that were getting together and trying to work out nature. And that's probably partly due to the fact that the church kind of owned education for everybody. And a lot of people didn't read. And so again, the church folks that read were usually in the clergy or the monastic folks. So ultimately what you end up with is people trying to learn on their own about truths that maybe the church wasn't as excited about. So I think that there's a sense of that's where maybe the sense of secrecy that kind of comes into this, is that there really was a time when they were trying to get together to learn stuff, they had to be really, really careful about who knew about it, because of course the Inquisition and everything else were still kind of part of the name of the game, and you had people that would rat on you. So they had to be really careful about their secrets. And when they did get together, the idea of the beginnings of the college, if you will, of the Royal Society, is ultimately testing. This gets back to the experimental thing that we're talking about with particle physics. It says basically their motto is that don't believe people's word. Go out and test it yourself. And so they would constantly do all these different experiments, and they were like crazy. Some of the stuff they did, blood transfusions between animals and all kinds of other crazy things, among many other situations, trying to evacuate air to see what happens in a vacuum. I think there's one story, and I don't know, it was Robert Hooke or one of them had tried to do it in a great big room to see what would happen if they were in it. And of course he fainted because he didn't have enough oxygen. They had to go in and kind of help him out. That may be, an apocryphal sort of thing, but I don't know. But that seems to be out there. But the point is that they did just experimented like crazy, and they would show, here's my result. Let me try it. Let me try it. Let me try it. And so there was this constant sense of trying to learn what was going on. And really that's kind of the, there, you can assign individuals, but I think that's sort of the birth of the idea of a real experimental science in trying to take a look at the world around you and understand what's going on.
Oh, it's so exciting. And I heard the other day that around the time Einstein was doing his work, we didn't really know that there were so many other galaxies out there. And I was just floored in the last couple of years to learn that most everything we can see in the night sky is simply from our own galaxy, with perhaps one
Yeah.
exception, with
Yeah.
the naked eye. And that now we know there are millions, if not billions, of other galaxies out there. And my gosh, to have such an explosion of understanding in just 1 century, I'm curious, Sandy, whether we're talking the macro or the micro. Do you have a sense or an excitement about what you think might become revealed to us in the next few decades, say 3, 4, 5 decades, or even century?
Always. And I don't think, anybody that kind of touches this stuff after a certain point, you can't help but kind of think, because your imagination goes and you kind of think, what if, or what would this look like? It is interesting that you kind of mentioned the development of how our perspective always is starting from our own ego. We started putting the us at the center of the universe, the earth. That was the geocentric. And then all of a sudden we realized we got dethroned from that one. But then again, we thought, okay, well, that was it. We've got our little solar system. Well, then you realize, no, we're actually part of a bigger galaxy. And then it was really kind of within that decade of Einstein in the 20s, and then with Hubble, that they begin to realize that not only are there galaxies, but there's tons of them out there. We're not even the center of the universe. We're just a little blip of in the galaxy among billions of other galaxies. So that perspective rapidly got thrown as far as ourselves being at the center of attention, if you will. And all you have to realize is in the time frame that reveals, that was just from that part, from Einstein to now, 100 years. That's a nanosecond in the history of the world. And it's to imagine what it would be like in another 100 years, given the exponential growth of what we do, 1,000 years, that you kind of just go, what could it possibly, what are we going to find? What's going to be dark energy or dark matter? What is that? Are we going to see unification of things? And what will that look like? So you can't help but be in that kind of frame of mind. And I think that's kind of the whole idea behind kind of just a sense of learning that I think people always push back against. That's maybe one of the downfalls that we have, at least in our own society, is that we see education and learning as something as a means to an end. We spend our time saying, well, I got to get this certificate so I can get a job. And I see a lot of people that seem to just sort of shut down after a while. They need to learn what they do in their job, but that's about it. But there's not that sense of just like wonder that says, wow, what else is out there? Or what else can I learn? And to me, that's the hook that has to happen for people. But it's sadly not there for a lot of individuals. And that's a real problem.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And it for me sort of evokes this question around how the modern expression of science has sort of desanctified a lot of our kind of secular views of the world, of each other, of our lives and lifestyles. And I'm curious, as we seem to be progressing in certain respects in our understanding, especially in the realm of physics and mathematics. Somebody like Fritjof Capra comes to mind, who we discussed the other day with his amazing seminal book, Tao of Physics, published, I think, in the 1970s. It's sort of bringing back in this sense of sacred wonder, awe, reverence to the scientific discussions. And I'm curious, asking a question sort of on two levels. Among your scientific colleagues in the academic realm, do you find that there's a deep sense of wonder, awe, and even a sense of the sacred? And then the second part of this question is, do you see the trend developing in a direction where more and more of us are going to be able to sort of hold in both hands science and this deeper sort of spiritual relating with the world.
Yeah, I kind of have no doubt. I realize that, there's a lot of, folks, when you talk among your own colleagues, that you generally tend to, in the science, you tend not to touch on these other subjects because you don't really know where they are. And there's a story on that. But I'll mention before I do that is that ultimately, we lost sight of the kind of unification with the world and the joy of just learning back in the early days, because as I mentioned, when we had astrology as a name for looking at the stars, the term for most of the folks back then was a natural philosopher. And that was applied to anybody that was really trying to understand the world in all its myriad forms. Once we came along with the word science, which essentially means to know or knowledge, it kind of suddenly drew a line in the sand and said, okay, we know and you don't, kind of thing. Not that that was the intent, but there was a sort of a solidification that said, so you're not really searching anymore, you already know. And even though that we'd get pushback from the sense of scientists thinking that, the fact is that people pick up on that. When they enter a science class, they get the feeling like it's all done now, and they're just getting a bunch of facts and so on. And trying to dispel them of that is usually quite a chore as a teacher. But one of the colleagues that I worked with at the college a bunch of years back, who, she was in the chemistry department, and I had gotten a chance to talk with her, and it come to find out that she was very religious and spiritual, but you wouldn't have known it because in our own little milieu, you don't really kind of talk about those things. It just sort of is one of those, you kind of get to try to see where people are and go there. But if you don't know otherwise, then you just don't do it. The organization that our college is a part of is a bunch of about 60 or so Catholic colleges and universities are part of a group called Collegium. And what's nice there is that when you go, it's an intellectual faith and intellectual sort of center of trying to develop that as far as your presence on a Catholic college. What does that mean? It isn't necessarily for Catholics, it's for anybody that's on the campus as a faculty member trying to figure out what their role is on a campus like that. And you get everybody from all the disciplines. And what's a joy is to get together with people that you already know are probably going to have a little bit of that spiritual sense. Talking, you do discipline-specific gatherings besides everybody mixed together, so you can kind of talk about many of your issues. And this, of course, is one of the issues that comes up all the time. You can't talk because you're afraid that you're going to get categorized into something. But with everybody that's there, you know that you've got that freedom, and everybody talks about all these different things, and it's a wonderful thing. Where this goes, I've kind of gotten to the point where that the best thing that we can do is carry the torch forward with those of us who see the light on this front. I think spending too much time trying to battle the people that don't buy into it or aren't spiritual or see religion and science as being never the twain shall meet. I think there's a certain point when, I'm not going to waste energy trying to convince you. I'm just going to go with the people that are moving forward and drag everybody into the wake. Because I think there's more people that are kind of realizing that there's something deeper there. And I think our message has to be, yes, there is, and let's help you find it. We don't have to be at odds in any way, shape, or form.
It's really wonderful. And, one of my favorite lineages of thinkers and natural philosophers, from Kant to Goethe to Nietzsche, Steiner, Carl Jung, right up into Joseph Campbell. And by the time we get into these modern guys like Jung and Campbell, we don't necessarily think of them as scientists anymore, although Jung, of course, had a medical training. But many of those in that line were Freemasons. And it's so interesting to me that, we have Joseph Campbell exploring myth and mythology in cultures all around the world, all of these different ways of understanding and explaining and describing and sharing story about our situation in this vast cosmos. And I'm just curious, I know you've been doing some exploring of Joseph Campbell recently. What are you discovering there that might kind of tie back into the scientific work that you're doing?
Well, I've kind of discovered him in terms of actually from more of the Masonic side, and I think it's the impact of how you think about yourself and about you in the world is important, regardless of whether you're a scientist or otherwise. So I think it impacts anybody and everybody. What's interesting is the sense, and this kind of a little bit of a sense of the Masonic background in here. I was struck by a particular article by a grandmaster, former grandmaster from California, because when you look at the fraternity itself, it talks about um, there's a sort of a deeper sense of these mystery religions from way, way back in the early days, the Eleusinian mysteries and mystery cults that were really after a kind of a deep spiritual development and growth. And at the same time, you also seem to have another strain in our sort of quality, which seems to head towards being a good person. In other words, there's a moral sort of strain to it. And trying to reconcile those was kind of difficult. I would see both of them and trying to figure out how to make those all work. And an interesting article, as I said, by John L. Cooper, he's a 33rd degree Mason, and he wrote about what he called the double helix in Freemasonry. And the double helix, he says, is both of those things. One was Neoplatonist in its sort of beginnings, and is really getting at the spiritual growth and development, kind of looking at a sense of that deeper mystery of ourselves. But at the other side was a more stoicism kind of thing, which headed towards the, being a good person, a citizen, and a moral person, and integrity, and all of the different terms that go with that. And that the two strains are part of the DNA helix, but of course, so one in each, but they're all part of one thing. What connected them was the idea of myth. And that's where Joseph Campbell kind of came into this, and thinking about this connection is these myths that tell us bigger stories about ourselves, how we fit into this world, and what is the message for me. And I think that to me was, in reading what he had to say, I can't summarize it, and I'm terrible at remembering what quotes people have, but ultimately there's a sense that, as with everything, it's an inward journey. And more people, I think, are desperate to do this. So whether you're a scientist, whether you're, a English person, history, or you're just a mechanic, that inner journey, I think, is an important piece for all of us to discover. And ultimately, there's a kind of a unification that is desired. There's a unity here. We're seeking a kind of reconnection, if you will, with the divine, whatever you want to call that. That reconnection, I think, is extremely important. And as I kind of mentioned, when we talk about science, and all the stuff that's out there, it includes, of course, the whole breadth. That's biology, chemistry, physics, math, computer science, but also on that level is ecology. And I think that one of the interesting things is to recognize that unity, reclaiming and reconnection with the divine, really includes everything. It's yes, it's with our fellow humans on the earth, but it's with all of creation. And that includes the world around us and how we take care of it. We do a pretty crappy job of taking care of each other these days. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people out there that are doing it. And that's what I mean about kind of the torch that has to be carried. We may not be good at fighting the ones that don't want to listen, but our best thing is to drag people along into, the vision of where we want to go. And I think that unity is an extremely important concept in here in everything that we do.
It's so interesting, and I'm curious. I want to ask you, being in the Grand Lodge of Vermont as a Freemason, as the Grand Junior Warden, um, can you tell us, what does that mean, and what is Masonry looking like right now in Vermont? And I imagine many of your students and others in your community might come across some of these wild conspiracy stories on the internet and so on. And I'm just curious, how do you, when folks ask, gosh, you're a Mason, what does that mean? What do you do? What is Masonry? How do you respond to those kinds of inquiries?
It's I've gone back and forth on how to respond with a kind of an elevator speech, and it's what I found. I was helped along with the reality of a question like that is to bounce it back to the questioner and say, well, what are you looking for? Because a lot of times you could answer the question with certain aspects of what it is you're trying to describe, masonry or otherwise, and you may not be answering their question. You may have completely missed the mark. So a lot of times I'll just bounce it back, and then you can enter into a dialogue with them more easily. Because the elevator speech is really, really hard. But in the short answer, if you will, is the way we kind of operate is, as I mentioned, our kind of our background is that kind of sense of strains, two strains of working on ourselves. It's a personal journey when you really think about it. It's a fraternity, absolutely. But the way we, our sort of official birth is from the Grand Lodge of England, which is now the United Grand Lodge. And that ultimately they granted charters to different lodges in different places. And then after a while that began to grow. So here in the United States, each state, for example, and of course it's all over the world as well. So you have countries with Grand Lodges, and there you have to be a little bit more careful because masonry is, there's all kinds of masonry out there. But for the United States, there's a sort of a standard Freemason that follows certain sort of traditions, ancient landmarks, and so on. And each of the states is its own jurisdiction, if you will. So you can think of it as like its own country. And if they're not doing anything really, really bad, you recognize them. And there's kind of like almost like a, United Nations thing. I can go to that state, or they can come to our state and be recognized. But within that, each of them has an overarching Grand Lodge, which gives the charters to each of the lodges in a kind of pyramid kind of concept, so that they can operate in the same way. Ultimately, the goal of Freemasonry, I think, in many ways, is and this is we say it's to make good men better, but it's so much deeper than that. Because as I said, it's a spiritual journey. It does have aspects of trying to discover the inner soul of yourself, but also of being reminded about being a good person and so on, which a lot of organizations do, but it's intertwined with something a lot deeper. So that's the idea. And when we have rituals, and the idea of ritual here is to, when you go through ritual, there's a transformation that really should be taking place. If you look at it from the right perspective. A lot of people don't, and we haven't done a very good job of education, to be honest with you. And this is something we're still trying to revisit, because if you think about ritual as just being, well, you got to memorize this, then you miss the point. Think about somebody who memorizes a line in poetry or a sonnet from Shakespeare. You don't do it just because somebody told you to memorize it. You do it because there's something internal that you want to convey outward. And I think that's the true meaning of the idea of a ritual. As somebody has pointed out, when you say that you learn something by heart, learning by memory, you learn it by heart, that means it becomes a part of you. So our ritual is a transformation concept and a way of imbuing you with what we have to say. But really, it's meant to be a fertile ground for everybody to find their path. And so that's the nice feature about what we are. Within the lodges, it behaves a little bit like a business. So there's kind of like a top 3 officers that we have, and then we've got a bunch of other ones. We have treasurers and secretaries. And then the Grand Line, which is just a copy of each of the little mini lodges, is the big state version of it. That's like being a CEO and vice president and so on for the whole state. So there's a business part of it. The problem is that many lodges got too caught up in the business stuff because that's something they knew, that they kind of forgot the spiritual side of things. And so we're running into problems trying to attract members into the fraternity because they misunderstand what we're about. We do charity, we like to get together, and so on, but ultimately we're not a charity organization. We don't go out and build houses for people. That doesn't mean we don't, but it's not our purpose. The idea is to foster that inner sense so everybody goes out and does what they feel is the right thing for them to do in the world. So as far as conspiracies, well, it all has to do with the fact that, we've kept ourselves secret for a while. It's a misunderstanding because now we're kind of realizing that was not the way to go. We're not a secret society because, as people will say, you can find out who we are. We're a society with some secrets. And at the very basic level, you would say, well, that's, our words and handshakes and all that stuff, which is really modes of recognition. But in a deeper sense, as some people will tell you, learning about the mysteries, the deeper mysteries. There were things that you weren't meant to know about yourself that you should address until you're ready. So there's a deeper sense of secrecy in there that really is harder to explain unless you're part of it. People love conspiracies. I don't know if you can do anything about it, but ultimately our best bet, and which we've been trying to do, is to try and change the front end message. England has been trying to do that with their Grand Lodge. They've been putting out a lot of things to try and change the public message about what they do. And the Scottish Rite, the Northern Masonic jurisdiction here, in Lexington, Massachusetts, where their headquarters is also doing the same thing. It's not just a man, a Mason sort of promotional campaign in trying to get people to realize, hey, we're right here, and this is what we stand for. This is nothing secret. In fact, if truth be told, we talk about this among ourselves and people say they're trying to take over the world. Well, man, if we could take over the world, just think about what the world could be if they were actually following some of the principles that we profess.
Yeah, that reminds me of the documentary that I saw a few months back, Terra Masonica, that gives this kind of worldwide tour of Freemasonry in our modern times. And I was struck when they were looking at a lodge in Jerusalem where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian men came together and meet in this spirit of brotherly love. And of course, Benjamin Franklin, one of the great founders and framers of the United States, did so much in the Philadelphia area, which is known as the city of brotherly love.
Yeah.
And if that's the kind of thing that the organization can spread and propagate, why, I think that'd be pretty good for our whole planet.
I would certainly think so. And that love, that sense is really a very sacramental concept that we're trying to promote. And that particular image that you mentioned is what we're about. Ultimately, when you look at the different people from different religions coming together in brotherly love, that statement, I don't think you're going to find anywhere else in any other organization around the world. That says volumes about what we really represent and what we're trying to promote. The problem, of course, is that we're an organization populated by humans. And so once again, it's flawed. So do we make mistakes? Yeah. Do we have people that have egos that get in the way? Yeah. But you can't use that to drag it down. You have to use the ideal, the vision of where it meant to be, because ultimately that pushes us or pulls us forward into where we should be going, rather than worrying about the mistakes that some humans do, which they're going to do.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let me take a moment to remind our audience that this is the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron William Perry, and today we're visiting with William Karstens, also known as Sandy, talking about particle physics and sacred geometry, and also learning a bit about Freemasonry and the history of natural philosophy over the last several centuries. I'd like to thank our partners and supporters. Of course, many of these great companies I'm about to mention are offering our audience and our Why on Earth community discounts on their products and services, which you can find when you go to whyonearth.org and go to the partners and supporters page. This includes Earth Coast Productions, the Lidge Family Foundation, Alpine Botanicals, Purium, Earth Hero, Liquid Trainer, Vera Herbals, Growing Spaces, Soil Works, Earth Water Press, 1% for the Planet, Dr. Bronner's, and Waylay Waters. Of course, I'd also like to thank all of our monthly contributors who have made the decision to sign up and make a monthly donation to our work. If you haven't yet done that, you can go to whyonearth.org and click on the donate button and set that up at any level that works well for you. If you'd like to set up at the $33 or greater level, you'll get monthly shipments of the Waylay Waters, hemp aromatherapy, soaking salts, and massage oils sent to you as a thank you. And of course, I'd also like to thank those in our stewardship circle who are helping with substantial grants and donations to support not only our podcast series, but also our community mobilization work for soil regeneration, climate action, neighborhood resilience, and culture of kindness. And a huge thanks to everybody making all this happen. And it's really, to me, Sandy, interesting to start connecting a lot of these, different dots that I imagine many of our friends in our communities may not have thought of as being so connected previously. And I'm curious, as an educator, the joy of learning that you seem to possess really comes through in a conversation like this. And I can only imagine that as an educator, as a teacher, some of that joy and that passion might be contagious, perhaps. I'm curious, when you're teaching some of these topics and subjects, what is that experience like, working in particular with young adults?
It's morphed over time, and it's gotten better. The early times you're still trying to figure yourself out in the context, but over time you begin to realize you see more of the joy of getting past the difficult parts, because we always bemoan, at least in the physics community, that we're not like the English folks where we can talk about some romantic novel and get into deep discussions about it right off the bat. We have to basically confront an audience that already is fearful of what you have to offer. Some of them have to take it. So you've got an audience that's not exactly thrilled at being there. So confronting that has taken a while to kind of get through. And I think that after a certain point, when you kind of get to the point where it's all kind of a part of you, and you're less worried about the details that you were worried about before, because you've come to understand that for the most part, what most people come away with is usually only what do they say, 30% of what you have to say in the whole big scheme of things, and probably less when it comes to science or mathematics, unless they're actually majors. So I kind of switched gears in terms of the way I saw it. And not that I didn't teach, the subject matter was still the same, but it's just how you approached it, and realized that I'd rather have more fun doing it than trying to battle whether they're, mad at having to take the course or not having difficulty. And so I just, and I'm still working at that, trying to change the mindset to just, like we said, the joy of just what's fun about this is that there's actually some cool things. So it was easier once I went down that path to intersperse in the midst of doing the stuff we had to do, things that are of interest. So I would mention, did you know Newton was actually an alchemist? And I would talk about, when we do electricity and magnetism, we'll talk about the beginnings of the ideas of current. And I would introduce Mary Shelley, because at the time, the first sort of sense of a life force was discovered when that fork and knife went into the frog's legs and it jumped. And so all of a sudden there's fosters a story about a life force having to be associated with electricity. And lo and behold, you get the Frankenstein story. But then if you dig deeper into that, you realize, oh yes, but there's also a whole lot more in the Frankenstein story. Did you know that there's a deeper thing there about creator and what was created and so on? So you kind of get into these conversations with the students. Plus, you're able to kind of poke fun. Like I'll do more of, well, I know we got to do this, and yeah, here's one of the things we got to do, and it's kind of part of the game. But I also give them different ways of looking at it, and just trying to get at a sense that this is actually kind of fun. And yes, there's some drudgery, things that you have to kind of learn, just like anything else. Really, it's the same thing that you would have to do, and I usually use the example of playing an instrument or playing a sport, right? You got to do the etudes to kind of practice your agility with your fingers or embouchure or whatever. It's not necessarily fun. You're not playing an orchestra, a symphony of some sort or a great concerto. You got to do it. And the same thing for sports. There's some, basic routine things you have to do. They're not fun necessarily, but they're what you keep you adept. And so sometimes I'll use that as an example to just say, here's what we got to do to just keep ourselves fresh, but here's where it's going. Here's where we kind of could be going with all of this stuff. And it becomes more fun. After a while, it just becomes more fun as you make that recognition.
That is a great trend. More fun. I like that. I'm writing that down right now. And Sandy, you've been kind enough to share your email address with our audience in case anyone would like to reach out to you. It's wkarstens@smcvt.edu, and we'll share this in the show notes. And folks can also connect with you via Facebook at william.karstens.9. That's the number 9 at the end, which will be in the show notes as well. And before we sign off our discussion for today, I want to ask you, Sandy, about Richard Rohr and St. Francis, because these two interesting fellows came up in our recent discussion. Yeah. And Richard Rohr is one of the writers I really admire now, and actually referenced him a bit in my book, Why on Earth. Compliments to my wonderful editor, Maura Stiles. But I'd like to kind of tie this whole conversation together, landing on a bit more of a mystical spiritual note with the figure St. Francis and our contemporary Richard Rohr, and ask you to riff on them a bit.
Yeah, as I mentioned to you, I had discovered him when I was working with folks on the campus. We do a Lent Advent thing, and the guy that I work with had sent me an article that was from Richard Rohr, and I read it, and it was like blown away with it. And I just said, this is really interesting. And I'd found more about him, and now I get regular weekly meditations from him. I've gotten already several of his books, and read through, and it's the sense of kind of really pushing the envelope here in developing and seeing the world in certainly from the Christian perspective, which is where he's coming from, and realizing all that you've been sort of reading about before was stilted in much of the way of what it was really meant to promote. I can't encapsulate that here, of course, but it really opens up the door to a much more meditative and spiritual sense of things. And because he's a Franciscan priest, so he draws from St. Francis, and of course, who do we have as a pope right now, who's trying to make some changes in, I think, a more positive direction, and he's getting a hit from the conservatives because they want things in the old ways. It's interesting to note that, you've got, and this was, I don't know if it was Ilia Delio, who's a theologian from Villanova, who wrote The Emerging Evolving Christ. And ultimately, the sense of what's been lost in certainly the Catholic Church seems to be something in which the society and science has moved along, and the Catholic Church sort of pretends to stay up, and they've got their own, Vatican astronomer and everything else. But they haven't really changed anything from back. They're still left in the Middle Ages in the way they think about many of these things. And I think there's folks out there that are trying to make those changes and realizing that there's a deeper spirituality that's going on here, a mysticism that is completely missed. And once you start reading a little bit about this stuff, you realize what's been missing. And what I like about St. Francis is that his connection with the natural world is probably the most prevalent feature about him. And as we talked before, he would converse with the animals, with the earth, and everything else as being kind of really interested in them. That sounds a little bit funny sounding, but it was really a very serious connection. And that unity, removing ourselves from an ego position, and this is a big part of what Richard Rohr promotes. And his latest book actually is a kind of a combination of some things he's talked about before, a kind of order, disorder, reorder concept. It's another trinity there, in which you basically dismantle the ego view of ourselves and kind of reorient ourselves into a much more unified kind of way of seeing things. And like St. Francis, he looks at everything, including ourselves and the world around us, as being worthy of sacramentality. So when we think about taking care of the earth, it is just as important as taking care of each other. And those are the themes that kind of begin to come out from these discussions. And the more you read about it, they've got some great pithy statements. I couldn't begin to tell you what they are off the top of my head, but they really get at some of these concepts. And I suggest for any of your viewers who are interested in the sustainability concept is to understand it for themselves, because really, this is a transformation in the people that we have on the earth. You can put all the technologies about how to do sustainable growing in a farm community or whatever, but without people buying into it, it really is just it's mechanical. So I think that what ultimately has to happen is people have to be transformed. And I find in those writers a pathway towards recognizing that and realizing that you've been missing something all along. And I think people know it. They know it inside because people seek out nature. They seek out that quiet solitude. You hear it all the time, even in the classrooms. How many teachers do we see who practice a little bit of meditation before they start their class? I've done that with some things with some groups of the church that I've done, that the thing they remember, they say, wow, I always thought it was a little bit kind of, maybe I'm not a big person to do it, but they responded very positively and realized that in the lives that we live today are so devoid of just some peace and quiet. People seem to be afraid to be with themselves, their own thoughts. And I think that's a pathway towards recognizing a kind of a unity that's there, but you have to get people out there to see it, to recognize it. And that's why, from my own experiences in scouting, and certainly from my own family and being taken out into nature, you have to recognize it and see it. And that way your connection is much more real than some abstract person telling you that, hey, it's good to conserve water. It's a good thing to, do this for our planet. If you don't have that real connection, I think it's abstract. So the more we can get people to recognize this, I think is really is a huge thing to do, I guess, however you want to say it. But that's what needs to happen. And I know that people are looking for it. They really are. But so that's and I know I haven't told you much about either of those two people in any deep sense, but I know our time is short, and perhaps we can delve into it on another talk down the line. But I think the message would be for your viewers to say, take a look at these individuals, read some of their books, and I think you're going to be absolutely astounded at what's there and the spirituality that is associated with St. Francis, especially given what I presume will be your viewers.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful, Sandy. And I love the idea of having another conversation at some point down the road. That would be wonderful. I'd like to plant that seed with you as well. And I want to thank you on behalf of the Y on Earth community for taking time to visit with us today and share so much. It's been such a gift. I've got pages of notes here, and
we only scratched the surface.
Indeed. And yeah, thanks again. And before we sign off, just want to invite if there's anything else you'd like to say or share.
The last thing I'll mention, which I know for both of us have been are members of Phi Beta Kappa, and our basic motto, Philosophia Biu Kubernetes, means essentially the love of wisdom is the pilot of life, but I like to think of it as the love of learning is the guide of life, is usually the more sort of pedestrian way of saying it. And I would say that to me is a huge piece of what should be a part of everybody's motto in philosophy, is to just love of learning. And I would put that out there for everyone to make, more public, I guess. So that's my sign off.
It's really wonderful. It's beautiful. I'll include that in the show notes. And thanks again, Sandy. Really appreciate it.
It was a real pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to seeing you down the line. Thank you very much.
Yep, look forward to it.
The Y on Earth Community Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series is hosted by Aaron William Perry, author, thought leader, and executive consultant. The podcast and video recordings are made possible by the generous support of people like you. To sign up as a daily, weekly, or monthly supporter, please visit yonearth.org/support. Support packages start at just $1 per month. The podcast series is also sponsored by several corporate and organization sponsors. You can get discounts on their products and services using the code YONEARTH, all one word with a Y. These sponsors are listed on the yonearth.org/support page. If you found this particular podcast episode especially insightful, informative, or inspiring, please pass it on and share it with a friend whom you think will also enjoy it. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your support. And thank you for being a part of the Y on Earth community.